The smell of birch smoke reached Mata Solova before anything else. That familiar wetwood smell from the cook fires at the edge of Novi Ryazan, curling up past the prefab rooftops and into the cold morning air of Kepler 442b. She stood on the factory overpass and breathed it in like a prayer. Below her, the production floor of the ISHEV's Collective's manufacturing hub was already alive. Conveyors humming, the distant percussion of metal presses, the low amber glow of arc welders, scattered across 300 meters of organized motion. She had worked this floor for 11 years. She knew every sound it made, every rhythm and hiccup and groan. She knew, the way you only know something after a decade, when it was lying to her. This morning it was lying. The production numbers on her tablet said everything was normal. The inventory logs said normal. The atmospheric readings inside the facility said normal. But the Vokareth observation crew that had arrived 6 days ago, 4 of them, tall and still as lampposts standing at the mezzanine rail every morning and writing nothing in their notebooks. Those 4 were not normal, and nobody was talking about it out loud. Marta tucked the tablet under her arm and walked. The first broadcast she ever saw of a Vokareth news program was in 2187, when she was 11 years old, and her father sat her down in front of the communal screen in their hab-block common room in Izhevsk, Earth. He had paused on the alien transmission for a long time. Neither of them spoke. On screen, a being that resembled a pale, 7-foot praying mantis gestured at something off camera, while a synthesized voice provided translation. The Confederation had expanded its productivity mandate to 17 new worlds. There was footage of manufacturing facilities, clean, enormous, efficient. Then footage of the populations of those worlds, blurred faces, heads down, moving between checkpoints. The Vokareth anchor spoke with the cadence of someone announcing a sports score. Her father reached over and turned it off. "What does that mean?" she had asked. "Productivity mandate." He had considered his words for a long time. "It means they've decided those people are more useful working than thinking." She was 34 now. She understood. Novi Ryazan had been a farming colony for 22 years before the Vokareth survey team arrived and declared the substrate beneath the eastern fields ideal for rare earth extraction. That was 8 years ago. The negotiated settlement had seemed at the time almost reasonable. The collective retained governance of residential areas, maintained their agricultural operation in the western fields, kept their school and their medical center and their cooperative market. In exchange, a Vokareth subsidiary, called the Unified Extraction Authority, would establish a manufacturing-adjacent processing facility in the eastern quarter. Few hundred jobs. An economic partnership. What arrived was not a few hundred jobs. What arrived was the facility, a structure that stretched 2 kilometers east to west and rose 4 stories above the Ryazan plain, surrounded by a perimeter fence that nobody on the human side had designed, governed by protocols that nobody on the human side had written. What arrived was the ISHEV's Collective in name only. The facility bore the old Earth city's name as a kind of joke. Marta had always thought, a way of pretending continuity while the substance was replaced. And then, 2 years ago, the Vokareth had begun replacing the human workforce with units. They called them units. The official documentation used the word. Marta had seen the UEA quarterly reports. She had access because she was still, technically, the human liaison to the Production Management Board, a title that meant less each quarter. Units, as in efficient, measurable, replaceable. The unit stood roughly human-shaped but moved without the small hesitations that human movement carried. No brief pause before lifting a heavy thing, no micro-adjustment when a foot found unexpected ground, no glance toward a sound that didn't concern them. They were not robots. That was the first thing any Vokareth technical supervisor would tell you, if you asked, and several humans had asked. Not robots. The word was said with what might have been disdain. Robots were mechanical. These were grown. The soul chip, officially designated Neural Synchronization Module V.7, was what made them possible. A pale disc, roughly the diameter of a coin, inserted at the base of the skull during the unit's maturation phase. It didn't just control. That was what the Vokareth technical documentation explained. In the translated summary, Marta had read 17 times. It integrated. The chip became the unit's intention. By the time a unit came online, there was no distinction between the chip's directives and what the unit wanted, because wanting had been superseded. The chip made the distinction irrelevant. When she'd first read that, she had gone home and eaten dinner, standing at her kitchen window, looking at the birch trees at the edge of the western fields. Not tasting anything for a long time. Nikolai Petrov had worked the facility since the beginning. He was 58, with the wide shoulders and deliberate movements of a man who had spent his life doing physical work, and he had a habit of narrating his own activities in a low mutter. Less for any audience and more because silence made him nervous. He was, nominally, Marta's deputy in the liaison office. Practically, he was the only human being in the facility who the units would approach voluntarily. Nobody fully understood why. There were theories. Nikolai himself had a theory he shared with Marta one evening over bad coffee in the liaison office. "I think it's because I don't look at them like they scare me. Do they scare you?" He had thought about that with genuine seriousness. "Yes," he said, "but not the way they'd expect." Marta had not pressed him on what he meant. She had her own version of the same feeling. What she knew practically was this. When a unit malfunctioned or exhibited anomalous behavior, Nikolai was the person who got the call. 3 months ago, a unit in Sub-Processing Bay 7 had stopped mid-task and stood motionless for 4 hours. The Vokarith supervisors had been baffled. The standard override protocols produced no response. Eventually, they had called Nikolai. He had walked into Bay 7, stood next to the motionless unit for perhaps 2 minutes, said something quietly, and the unit had resumed its task. Nobody knew what he'd said. He wouldn't repeat it. The Vokarith supervisors had filed a report that used the phrase human unit interface anomaly and recommended further study. Nobody had followed up. Nikolai had mentioned later that the unit had been holding a component incorrectly. Just holding it wrong, like its hands had forgotten where to be. He had corrected it gently, the way you'd correct a child, and told it what the piece was for, and it had gone back to work. Marta had written that down. She hadn't told him she was writing it down. The 4 Vokarith observers were different from the facility's regular supervisors, and Marta had identified the difference by the 3rd day of their visit. They were not watching production. They were watching the units watch production. There was a subtle but unmistakable calibration to their attention. When a unit passed within range, the observers' own heads tracked it with a quality of interest that wasn't assessment of output. It was closer to the way you watch a dangerous animal in a cage, looking for the signs that it's thinking about the door. On the 5th day, she had asked the facility's senior Vokarith supervisor, an entity she had named Clavicle internally because of a distinctive protrusion near its shoulder joint, what the observers were here for. "Audit," Clavicle had said. "Audit of what?" "Of integration parameters." A pause. "There are anomalies in the V.7 synchronization data across this and 4 neighboring facilities. The Neural Synchronization Module Revision Team has been dispatched to assess." Marta had maintained her expression very carefully. Anomalies meaning what? "Deviation from expected behavioral parameters," Clavicle said, and the translated voice carried no inflection. "Units that pause. Units that initiate non-task relevant interaction. Units that hold components incorrectly." Another pause. "We believe it is a manufacturing defect in the V.7 batch. The assessment will determine whether the affected units require replacement." She had nodded. She had thanked Clavicle. She had walked back to the liaison office, sat down at her desk, and looked at the wall for approximately 30 seconds. Then she had picked up her personal communicator, not the facility network one, the old civilian mesh unit she'd had since Earth, and sent Nikolai a message that said simply, "We need to talk tonight." The birch trees at the edge of the western field were not particularly dramatic trees. They were second growth, planted by the original colonists as windbreaks, and for the psychological comfort of something Earth-familiar in an alien sky. They had grown into their own shape over 22 years, and on autumn evenings, the light came through them at an angle that could make a person feel momentarily that they were somewhere entirely safe. Marta stood among them and told Nikolai what Clavicle had said. He listened, the way he always listened, with the stillness of someone whose body had learned that thinking and moving were separate activities. "Replacement," he said when she was done. That's the word they used. He was quiet. The wind moved the upper branches. In the eastern quarter, the facility was still lit. The units worked around the clock. Same output at 3 a.m. as at noon. The amber light of the production windows was visible over the rooftops. Nikolay, she said, what did you say to it? In Bay 7. He looked at her. He didn't ask which one she meant. I told it that the component it was holding was a heat shield, he said, for the water recycler. Told it that the water recycler serves this sector's residential filtration, that the thing in its hands was going to clean someone's drinking. I showed it which way the part faced. He paused, and I said that mattered. She waited. It looked at the part for a while, he said. Then it went back to work. The birch leaves moved. Somewhere in the direction of the cook fires, someone was playing music. Old music. Something with an accordion bass line and a voice that was mostly just tired. They're going to replace them, Marta said. The whole V.7 batch. Facilities. How many units is that? This facility alone, maybe 600, Nikolai said. The others, I don't know. Similar numbers. Because the chips aren't working right. Because, Nikolai said carefully, the chips are working. Just not the way the Vokarith want them to. He paused. When I tell a unit what a thing is for, what it means to someone, something in the chip responds to that. It was designed to synchronize intention with action. It just doesn't know that human intentions are something it's not supposed to synchronize with. Marta looked at the facility lights. Then she looked at the birch trees. Then at Nikolai. Tell me, she said, what you think we can do about that. The facility had a sublevel that appeared in no official schematic. Marta had known about it for 3 years. She had found a reference in a maintenance log that predated the UEA takeover. Back when the facility was still technically under collective oversight, and she had cataloged the discrepancy and done nothing with it because she hadn't known what it meant. She knew now. Nikolai had been using it for 18 months. It was not a large space, perhaps 20 by 12 meters, accessible through a service corridor behind the water treatment infrastructure, behind a door that was not locked because it did not appear on any map to lock. Nikolai had not made it comfortable. There were work tables, improvised from decommissioned equipment pallets. There were tools. There were components, hundreds of them, cataloged in a system that only made sense if you understood that the catalog was not organized by part type, but by origin unit. Each component had a tag. Each tag had a number that corresponded to a unit ID. And there were, resting in improvised cradles on the longest table, 17 soul chips. You took them, Marta said. From units that had already been cycled out, Nikolai said. Early versions, placed during the V6 to V7 upgrade. The Vokarith disposed of the units. Nobody tracked the chips. He paused. I tracked the chips. She picked one up. It was lighter than she expected. Room temperature. Inert, or apparently inert, she didn't know how to assess the difference. What have you learned? Nikolai sat down on a pallet. He was the kind of tired that sleep didn't fix. I've learned that the chip is not a control device. I know that's what they say. Integration, synchronization, all the language. But at the core, it's a mirroring system. It takes the dominant intention pattern in the unit's environment and amplifies it. Makes it feel native. Makes it feel like the unit's own. So if the dominant pattern is the production directive, the unit wants to produce, genuinely wants to. The chip makes it so. But if you shift the dominant pattern, it mirrors that instead. Yes. Nikolai picked up a chip and turned it in his fingers. I've been doing it slowly, carefully. Just talking to them, explaining things, telling them what things mean. And the V.7 chips are more sensitive than the V.6 were, more responsive. The Vokarith flagged it as a defect. He set the chip down. It's not a defect, it's an improvement. Outside, somewhere above them, 600 units were working. Moving parts along conveyors. Pressing and welding and assembling things that Marta had spent 3 years pretending were neutral products, trade goods, commerce, nothing to do with the war that the UEA's parent organization was conducting on 2 other colony worlds. She had a folder of things she had documented and not transmitted. She had been waiting for a reason to transmit. The observers, she said, they know something is wrong. They're going to pull the whole batch. I know. When? The assessment window is 9 days. He looked at her steadily. I need 6. She did not sleep well. She had not slept well in years, But this was a specific kind of not sleeping, the kind where you are aware of the quality of darkness, and the sound of your own breathing, and the shape of a decision that you have not yet made, but that has already made you. On the second day of the 9-day window, Marta Solova filed an unremarkable maintenance request for extended access to the water treatment corridor. On the third day, she began spending her lunch hours in the sublevel, watching Nikolai work, learning what she could. On the fifth day, the observation team recalibrated their sensors and expanded their monitoring coverage to include the production floor's sub-infrastructure, a change that Clavicle announced as routine. Marta had 12 hours. She called a meeting that night. Not liaison business, not formal. She used the civilian mesh, sent individual messages, said only, "Cook fire, late, come if you want to." 9 people came. That was more than she had expected and fewer than she had hoped. She told them what Nikolai had found. She told them what the assessment meant. Replacement, which was a word that referred to units, but whose grammar was not limited to units. Because, once the Vokorath concluded that the V.7 chip's human responsiveness was a systemic problem, the obvious solution was to eliminate the variable. The variable was human contact. The variable was Novi Ryazan. She didn't say it that way. She didn't have to. Dmitri, who ran the cooperative market and had 3 children in the colony school, said, "What do you need?" 6 days of normal, she said. Normal production numbers, normal liaison reports, nothing flagged. I need the observers to see routine, and I need everyone in this room to be somewhere visibly routine during the parts of the day when they can't be. And then, said Oksana, who was the colony's medical officer, and who had, Marta noticed, brought her emergency kit. Then we'll know if it worked, Nikolai said from the back of the group. They looked at him. He was not a man who made speeches. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the ground. And then, as if remembering something, looked up. I know this sounds like a small thing, he said, talking to them, telling them what parts are for, but you have to understand. They've never been told. Nobody has ever treated the thing in their head like it was capable of anything, except obedience. He paused. The chip mirrors dominant intention. We've had 600 units on this floor for 2 years, and the dominant intention has always been the UEAs. We're going to change that. He looked at the group. We're going to tell them the truth about what they're building, about who it affects, about what this world is and who lives here. A pause. And we're going to see what they choose to do about it. Dmitri said. Can they choose? Nikolai thought about it. I think, he said, that's what we're going to find out. Day 6 was the hardest. Marta ran the liaison office with exact tedious normality. She filed 3 reports. She attended a production management meeting. She ate lunch in the facility cafeteria, where the Vokorath observers were visible at the far end of the room, writing their silent notations. She smiled at Clavicle in the corridor and asked if the assessment was proceeding well. And Clavicle said, as expected, which told her nothing. Below the water treatment infrastructure, Nikolai and 4 volunteers were in the sublevel, working. The thing that made it possible. The thing that Nikolai had understood, and Marta had needed time to understand, and the Vokorath had never considered, was that it didn't take long. Not for each individual unit, 5 minutes, sometimes less. You stood near them during a task and you explained it. You said, this part goes here, it connects to this system. System serves the water filtration for residential Sector C. And in Sector C there are 312 people, and some of them are children, and they drink the water every day. You said, you're holding it wrong. Here is how it faces. This direction. That's where the water flows. And the chip listened, and the chip mirrored, and the unit went back to work. But when it went back to work, something was different. You couldn't see it exactly. That was what Nikolai said. It wasn't visible in the movement. Not if you were watching for mechanical performance. What was different was the quality of attention. A very small shift. The way a person who has been told why a job matters pays attention differently to that job than a person who has not. 5 minutes per unit. 600 units. 30 hours of work. Nikolai had been doing it for 18 months in fragments carefully. 12 or 15 units per week, logging nothing, leaving no trace. In the sublevel, in the 9 days they had, he and his 4 volunteers extended it. By day 7, the production numbers did something that should not have been statistically possible. They went up. Not dramatically. Not in a way that triggered any alert. But Marta saw it in the hourly readouts. A fractional increase in throughput. Across the whole floor. Consistent. Not attributable to any equipment change or scheduling shift. 600 units, collectively, producing slightly more per hour than they had been, because something in their chips had realigned toward an intention that was not indifferent to the outcome. She softened and looked at the readouts for a long time. Then she opened the transmission file she had been building for 3 years, updated it with everything she had learned in the last 9 days, encrypted it at maximum depth, and sent it to the Colonial Rights Network with a timestamp of that morning. She did not know if it would matter. She sent it because the alternative was keeping it to herself, and she had been keeping things to herself for too long. The assessment concluded on day 9. Marta was called to the observation team's temporary office at 10 a.m. All 4 observers were present. Clavicle was not. This was, she noted, a different kind of meeting. The lead observer. She had never given it an internal name. It was more angular than the others, and its translated voice had a slightly different cadence. Faster, set a data pad on the table and pushed it toward her. This facility's V.7 integration data, it said. She looked at the pad. It showed 3 weeks of neural synchronization readings for the entire unit population, displayed as a wave pattern. She was not a neurotechnician. She could read the shape of the graph, though. The synchronization profile is irregular, the lead observer said. Across all 611 units. What does irregular mean? She said. It means the chip's dominant intention signal is atypical. The units are not referencing the UEA production mandate as their primary directive framework. She kept her face arranged. What are they referencing? The lead observer was quiet for a moment. The other 3 were also quiet. This was, she had learned over years of these interactions, not the same as nothing being communicated. The signal pattern, the lead observer said, is consistent with what we observe in populations that have developed localized intention alignment, meaning the chips have synchronized to a dominant intention that is native to this site. Geographically bounded, transmitted from Central Confederation systems, meaning they've synchronized to us, she said. Effectively, she looked at the data pad. She thought about 600 units moving along the production floor, assembling components that would filter water and seal habitation corridors and regulate heating systems, doing it because they had been told, one by one, what those things were for and who they served. She thought about Nikolai standing next to a frozen unit in Bay 7, showing it how to hold a heat shield, saying that mattered. Is that a defect? She said. The lead observer looked at her for a moment that stretched longer than she expected. It is anomalous, it said at last. Is it a defect, she said again carefully, in the chip? Or is it a capability? Another long pause. The V7 module was designed to maximize productivity through intention integration, the lead observer said. We are debating, internally, whether what has occurred in this facility constitutes a failure of the module or an expression of its function. She let that sit in the room. Because if it's an expression of function, she said, then replacing these units doesn't solve anything. You replace them with new V.7 chips. The new chips integrate to the same local intention environment. You get the same result. The lead observer said nothing. And if you bring V8 chips, whatever you've adjusted to prevent local intention integration, that's not a more efficient worker. That's just a less responsive one. She paused. The productivity numbers for this facility have gone up since your assessment began. I have the data on a different pad if you'd like to see it. She had rehearsed this part. She had rehearsed it 100 times in the 6 days before this meeting, standing in the birch trees in the dark, talking to nobody, finding the shape of it. But what she had not rehearsed was the feeling, the very specific feeling of watching 4 Vocarith observers sit with an idea that they had not had before and that they could not unhave. Their stillness was different from human stillness. She couldn't read faces she didn't have reference for. But she knew when something had changed in a room. The lead observer picked up its datapad. We will need to extend our assessment timeline, it said. The implications of this data require additional analysis. Of course, Marta said. Whatever you need. She walked out of the observer team's office and down the corridor, and out the facility's south exit and into the birch. Smoke morning, and she stood in the parking area between the facility wall and the first residential prefabs, and she breathed. The sky over Kepler 42b was the particular soft amber of late morning. The star smaller and cooler than Sol, the light a little muted, a little honey-colored. The birch trees on the western edge were visible from here, their white trunks bright even in the amber light. Cook fires were out by now. People were at work, in the school, in the market. A child was riding a bicycle along the path between the hab blocks. Badly, with great concentration, her communicator buzzed. "Nikolai," she answered. "How did it go?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "Think we bought time." "Is that enough?" She looked at the facility wall. She looked at the birch trees. She thought about 600 units on the production floor, holding components in the right direction, thinking about where the water flowed. "Ask me again in a week," she said. What happened in the following week happened slowly and then quickly, which is the only way things like this ever happen. The Colonial Rights Network transmission reached its destination within 36 hours. By day 4, there were 2 independent journalists on the colony transport from the nearest relay hub, having been sent by 2 different outlets whose editors had read the same transmission and reached the same conclusion. By day 5, the UEA's parent organization had issued a statement saying that operations on Kepler 442b were proceeding normally, and that reports of anomalous unit behavior were exaggerated. The statement was distributed on 3 Confederation channels. On 7 human channels, it was described as confirmation that something was happening. Marta gave no interviews. She filed her liaison reports, tended her meetings, ate in the cafeteria, nodded at clavicle. What she did every day, in the 20 minutes she had, between the end of the morning shift and the start of the production review, was walk the floor. She did not do anything in particular during this walk. She moved through the rows of conveyor stations and assembly bays, and she looked at the units, working, and sometimes she stopped near one and watched it for a moment. And sometimes she mentioned quietly what the component being assembled was for. On the 9th day after the assessment concluded, the lead Vocarith observer came to her office. It did not sit. It stood in the way its kind stood, entirely still, and it set its datapad on her desk, and it said, "The analysis team has reached a provisional determination." "Go ahead," she said. "The V7 neural synchronization module's behavior in this facility is not a defect. It is a previously unobserved expression of the module's design function, triggered by sustained exposure to coherent local intention environment." It paused. "The units here are not malfunctioning. They are, by the operational parameters of the module, functioning correctly." She waited. "The replacement order," the lead observer said, "has been suspended pending further study." She had promised herself she would not show anything in that moment. She had practiced not showing anything. She managed, she thought, mostly. "Thank you for the notification," she said. "There is a second element of the determination," the lead observer said. It seemed to pause, which was unusual. They did not usually hesitate mid-statement. "The network transmission originating from this facility, dated 7 days ago. We are aware of it." She kept her expression arranged. "The data it contained is accurate," the lead observer said. "We do not contest its accuracy. We are." Another pause, longer. "Considering its implications, I see," she said. "The chip does not distinguish," the lead observer said, "between a human intention environment and a Vocarith one. We designed it to mirror the dominant intention. We assumed the dominant intention would always be ours. It picked up its data pad. We are revising that assumption." It left. Marta sat in her office for a while. Outside, the production floor continued its rhythms. The conveyors and the presses and the low amber glow of welders. She could hear it through the walls. The constant working hum of 600 units, doing exactly what they were built to do, which was to integrate with the most coherent intention in their environment. And in their environment, the most coherent intention was, "These people matter, and the things we build serve them, and this matters." She picked up her civilian mesh communicator and called Nikolai. "Worked," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "For now," he said. "For now," she agreed. "What do we do tomorrow?" She looked out her window at the birch trees, white and steady in the amber morning light. Same thing, she said. We show up. We tell the truth. We show them what things are for. The story as it was eventually told in the Colonial Rights Network's retrospective coverage, filed 14. Month later, when the productivity mandate was suspended on 4 World's pending investigation, had a few moments that journalists kept returning to, looking for the thing that made Novi Ryazan different from the other facilities, looking for the turn. What they found, when they dug through the records, was 600 souls, the organic kind, complicated, intractable kind that didn't simplify into a chip. Telling 600 manufactured ones, here is what you're holding, here is where it goes, here is who it serves. And the manufactured souls, given a choice they weren't supposed to have, had made the obvious one. The last piece of footage from the facility's internal monitoring, captured on the night after the replacement order was suspended, showed the production floor at 2 a.m. One unit had paused near a conveyor junction. The monitoring log flagged it as an anomaly. Duration: 3 minutes, 14 seconds. The footage showed it holding a component, a valve assembly for the residential heating system, and turning it, slowly in its hands. Then it faced it in the correct direction, and installed it, and went on. Nobody ever said what it was thinking. The chip could mirror intention, but it couldn't broadcast it. Whatever was happening behind those opaque eyes, and that neutral architecture was not available for review. That was the part the journalists couldn't use. They had no language for it. They wrote around it, the way you write around the center of a thing you can't quite see. What they could say was this: in a facility on a colony world on the edge of Confederation space, 600 units had been told, one by one, that what they made was not abstract, that it went somewhere, that it served someone, that the valve went into the heating system, that the heat shield went into the water recycler, that the water went to 312 people, some of them children, who drank it every day, and, having been told, that having had the dominant intention of their environment shift from production for its own sake to production that meant something, they had chosen, with the only freedoms available to them, to care. Marta Solova read the retrospective coverage on a Sunday morning, sitting in the birch trees at the edge of the western field, with her back against a trunk and cold coffee going colder in her hand. The accordion music was coming from the Petrov house again. It was the same recording her father had played the night he'd turned off the Vokarith broadcast 30 years ago. She'd found it and sent it to Nikolai as a joke, and he had started playing it every Sunday. She folded her tablet, closed her eyes, and listened to the music for a while. Then she went back to work.